Welcome back. Now let's start topic 2. We will introduce loops and functions. The first example problem we're going to look at is a print right triangle. So essentially, given a number n, we want to print a right triangle of size n, and it's defined in this way. So for if n equals 1, we just want this plus sign. If n is 2, we want the plus sign here, and then we want a plus sign followed by a minus sign and plus by minus. And if 3, then we need to have 3 sides, the vertical side here, horizontal side here, and then this hypotenuse here. And if n is 4, this is what we want. Okay, so the 4 lines, and if n is 3, we have on the last line we have 3 minus signs, and if it's 4, we have 5, and if it's 5, we have 7. So this is what we want, and the problem asks you to write code to do that. So as you can see, we're going to need to repeat a lot of things. So given n, we need to print n lines, and within each n lines, we're going to repeat many of the operations. And that's what loops does. So in topic 1, we in fact already used the concept of loop, which we sort of use a macro to hide a little bit of what's going on. We just say repeat n, so that code is supposed to do repeat n, and in this topic we're going to explain why that code works, so the for loop works. But in this code we also going to use what's known as the string literals. So it's sort of just convenient to introduce this concept. We don't have to use it in this problem, but just for convenience. So in topic 1, we've seen single characters. So we have literal for a single character. Mostly we use the space character to separate different input. But we can also use other characters, capital A, lowercase a, digit, and this special symbol. So here, to print the shape, we're going to use a lot of the special symbols for characters. But when we want to print 2 or more characters together, we can also use the string literals. So traditionally, the standard introduction to programming, the first program you're supposed to do is called Hello World, which is basically you have this line. You print Hello World to the output. So in C++, this is what you do. Well, maybe there's end of line after this. But hello world, this is a string literal, so it has it's used to represent 0 or more characters. So single quote are used for character literal. So one character, we use a single quote. String could have more characters, we use double quote. So also here in the code we're going to show later, we use a /n to represent end of line. So to end a line, to start a new line in the output, we can use either end L or /n. They are not totally equivalent. So the advice is if you need to print many lines. So for example, if your code need to run within 1 second and you need to print, say more than 100,000, more than 10 to the 5 lines, then you should use a /n. And if you print a debug message, you should use endl. When debug message, you should never use a /n in your debug. Not never, but just for good habit, just always use endl. And both of these recommendations are because input and output is buffered. So in particular, output is buffered. So what this means is that when you output something, the data you want to output, the string you want to output, the character you want to output are first put into a buffer. So they don't immediately appear in the output yet. So then only when the buffer is full, then the underlying, the code will actually issue what's known as a system call. So essentially, and then these data are written out. So essentially, this part after the buffer full and you write out, this writing out is actually expensive compared with just writing to the buffer. So buffering will speed up. So if you need to write data many times, if every time you actually use this expensive process expensive system call to write it out, then the program will be slow. If you use a buffer, then you don't have to use the expensive part very many times. You can wait. You can just write to the buffer until it's full, and then you write it out. So when you use end-L, then they will force a writing it out. So this is also known as a flush the buffer. So essentially, anything in the buffer will be written out, whether the buffer is full or not. So that happens when you use end-L, end of line. So when you need to write many lines, you want to use \n. So you want to utilize the buffer so that you reduce the number of times you actually need to use system call to actually write it out. On the other hand, if you are debugging, you want to make sure the message goes out as soon as possible, because a lot of time when you debug, you are trying to rely on the printed message to decide until which point your code have executed. If you have an error that causes the termination of the program, so if oftentimes when those errors occur, the data in the buffer is not written out. The program is terminated immediately. So then you will get the wrong. There will be things your code supposed to print out, but you actually don't see. So if you rely on that for your debugging, this will confuse you. So if you are in a debug message, you always use NL, which will force the message to be written out. So the reason we have this \n for new line is because there on the keyboard there isn't sort of a printable character that corresponds with this new line. So if it's a letter, we have something. If it's a digit, we have something. If there exclamation mark, we have something. But new line, we don't have that sort of printable character. So therefore, we use what's known as escape character. We use a \, and then things followed it will be used to represent sort of special character. So \n represent new line. Another one that sometimes we'll encounter is the \t, which stands for tab. And also, because we use single quote for character literals, if we want to print a single quote, we use a \. We use escape. So we use \, single quote to represent single quote. We use a \, double quote to represent double quote. And because we use \, for this purpose, if we actually want to print \, which is needed for printing this triangle shape, right triangle shape, we use a double \. So another thing that we need to use is a for loop. So this is repeating things. So here I first use a concrete example. So this is a concrete example of for loops. It uses a syntax to explain what this for loop does. I'm going to use another concept. It's a go-to statement and labels. So I guess normally this is bad. So to explain one new concept, I use another new concept. But my hope is this other new concept of this go-to and label is fairly easy to understand. So then it helps understand exactly what's going on for this for loop. So this for loop, there are 3 pieces inside this parenthesis. So I use different color for them. There's a blue, purple, and the green, and then there's a statement after this parenthesis. So there is a 4 piece that form this for loop. So the way it works is first we execute the first piece. So this int I equals 0, we first execute that statement, and then the second is a condition. So we execute the if statement. So if I is less than n, so then we will execute the body. After we execute the body, we will execute the third component in this for loop. So in this case, I++. And after that, we will go back and then check this again. So go to means jump to a particular position. And this beginning column means give a name to this position. So this just because I want to jump to this piece of to this place to execute again. So beginning tells give this particular position a name so that I can say I want to jump to there. So this is just giving a label to this position. So by the way, this is actually legitimate C++ syntax. So C and C++ have labels and the goto statement. Java also have labels. It doesn't have goto statement, and the label is used in a slightly different way. So the meaning is essentially we execute to here and then we jump to here. So then what happens is this first statement is executed just once. This initial assigning I equals 0 just execute 1. And then every time we will check whether I is less than n. So long as I is less than n, we will execute the body, and then we will execute this sort of increment statement. So we execute this when I is 0, and then when do this I becomes 1, we jump back, and then we check whether 1 is less than n. If it's not, then we will execute this again. We add 1 to I again, and then we jump. So this will execute n times for I equals 0, 1, 2 until n minus 1. So when I equals n, this condition is no longer satisfied. The if branch is no longer execute. This branch is not executed, then we get out of the loop. So the loop finishes. So that's the for loop. So more generally, a for loop statement have 4 parts. There's a start statement, there's a condition, there's a step statement, and then there's a body statement. So the start statement and step statement cannot have semicolon. So we use the semicolon to separate these 3 parts. The body statement can be either a simple statement with a semicolon or a compound statement which you use the curly brackets. So the meaning of this first statement is this. So we execute start statement, and then we check condition. If condition is true, we execute the body statement and then the step statement, and then we go back to check again. So we check condition first before we execute the body statement. So it is possible that the body statement is never executed. So the condition may be false even when we start. Okay, so finally we can show the code for printing the right triangles. So we read in n, we need to print the size n right triangle. The first, this line print the first line, which is a single plus. So we use backslash n as end of line instead of ENDL. And because we have code to print the last line down here, but there isn't the last line if n is 1. So we have this if statement here. So we check if n is 1, we are already done. We just return 0. So this sort of early return, we check a condition. If it's satisfied, using this can generally help shorten the code. So because because if n is not 1, we don't need to write this else, and also we don't need to check other things. So when used carefully, this can sort of make your code shorter and does not sacrifice understandability. Okay, so then we will print the ith line. So I goes from 2 to less than n. So because the last line is different from the ones in the middle, so the last line is printed here. It starts with a plus, and then it has a bunch of minus signs in the middle. So we have you by observing the sample patterns, we can see that if n is 2, we want 1 of this. If n is 3, we want 3 of this. So the relationship is we want 2 times n minus 3 of this. So here, repeat, I still use the macro to do that instead of using for statements. So it's equivalent. I'm just showing that the same thing can be done in different ways. So this loop print the thing in the middle. So the middle line start with the vertical bar and then a bunch of white spaces and then followed by backslash. So here I'm using escaping for backslash, and then I use a new line. So this string consists of 2 characters that are escaped, backslash and new line. And if note that if n is 2, this loop actually execute, the body actually executes 0 times, because when I equals 2, I cannot be less than 2, so we directly go to here. Because when equals 2, there's no middle line, so it's just the first line and the last line. So let me actually use this to illustrate how to use the some online IDE. So let's copy the code and then go to the CodeChef IDE. So this is codechef.com/IDE, and this is if I go in, this is what I see. So I'm replacing the main statement here with my main statement, and let's do custom input, because let's say we enter 5, and then this will specify the input to be read. So then let's say we run. Yeah, and we get a compiler error. So see here it says the 14, 15 here means line number and character number. So it means line 14, which is here, and yeah, so it refer to here, 15 refer here, but that's less important. The more important part is the line number. So it tells us, and the message says repeat was not declared in this scope. So essentially they don't know what repeat is, and that's correct, because I forgot to include the repeat macro here. So of course it doesn't know what repeat is. So let's repeat x. So there are different ways of defining this repeat. Here I'm going to use equals x greater than 0, I minus. Yes, so let's try that. So I'm going to explain different way defining repeat next. So let's see whether this works. So so this should be this. Let's try that again. Okay, so now this is input, this is output. So this way you can run your code, you can provide input and test it out. You don't have to install software. Okay, to recap, the concept we covered in this example includes string literals, escape characters, and we discussed using \n versus end of line, and also the important concept of for loop.